CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Robin Dwyer.
And I'm Juliette Nance. Our top stories. Ukraine's president says 100,000 people are experiencing inhumane conditions in Mariupol and accuses Russia of capturing an aid convoy.
President Putin says Russia will start charging in rubles for gas supplies to what he calls unfriendly countries.
Search teams find a black box from the crashed airliner in southern China, thought to be the cockpit's voice recorder.
And the UK government promises a tax cut to help with rising living costs, but it won't take effect until 2024.
Vladimir Putin's special international envoy has quit the government and left Russia. Russian reports say Anatoly Chubais is in Turkey with his wife. It's thought his actions were in protest against the attacks on Ukraine.
Inside Ukraine, the United States says the country's army is regaining ground from Russian forces in some areas. But Russia is continuing to bombard the southern port city of Mariupol. Well, let's talk now to CGTN's Michael Voss, who is in Lviv. Michael, give us an update on the fighting on the ground.
Well, Robin, there is a lot of fighting going on just to the north of the capital, Kiev, both the northwest and the northeast. Perhaps the main one is this town of Makariv, where the Ukrainians say they have raised the Ukrainian flag on the entrance to this town. It's about 30 kilometers from the center of the capital. It's a key strategic town because it's on an important road that the Russians would need if they're going to encircle the city. But there is still fighting going on there. We're also hearing from the Ukrainians that further north they are managing to cut off Russian supply lines, and the Ukrainians are claiming that they may have just 3 days of fuel and ammunition and medicines left. But that we really can't confirm that part of it. What we can say, though, is that in the south, in Mariupol, it is being very heavily bombed. It's very hard fighting going on. The Ukrainians say that there's still 100,000 people trapped in this city in dreadful conditions. We're told, though, that the port area has not been bombed at all. So were the Russians to take Mariupol, they would have a working port. We're also hearing from there that a humanitarian convoy was seized by Russian troops and that they arrested all the drivers.
But, Michael, other humanitarian aid has been arriving in the area for weeks now, but is it reaching those who need it?
It's a big operation. Some of it is, some of it isn't. You've got about 100,000 tons of aid have come in here in the last couple of weeks, much of it here in Lviv. It's a huge logistical operation, trying to sort it out, get it out, and much of it's being done by volunteers, as I discovered when I went to visit one of the largest distribution warehouses here.
A truck carrying humanitarian supplies from Holland unloads its precious cargo at a huge distribution warehouse on the outskirts of Lviv in western Ukraine. It's one of half a dozen such government-run warehouses around the city, receiving daily deliveries from all over Europe.
We are thankful for everything European Union does for us, and we are ready to receive equipment and everything that will be necessary to rebuild our country in the nearest future.
What sort of humanitarian aid do you most need right now?
We need medicine, we need food, and we need medical equipment to help people. Actually, we need urgent emergency medicine for hospitals.
There's plenty of food arriving here, much of it tinned, but few fresh products or grains.
We need now something to prepare and to cook. flour, corns, vegetables. We need hot food, porridges, soups. That's enough. This will be good.
While we were filming, a second truck arrived, this one carrying supplies from Austria.
This place is a constant hub of activity. As soon as the trucks come in, there are hundreds of volunteers sorting through the products. In this case, it's toiletries. Over here are shoes and food. They're then packaged into separate containers, ready for taking out to those in need.
Everything here is donated by charities and individuals. The UN's World Food Programme has its own storage facility. Chinese aid has also been arriving in Ukraine.
So what do we have here?
Bedding.
That's bedding.
Ivana Seniv quit her job as a teacher to volunteer here the day the war started.
At first, we received significantly less support, but more and more trucks come every day from very different countries. Of course, this makes us happy. We receive not only humanitarian aid, but also letters and drawings from children wishing that we quickly win the war with Russia.
As quickly as supplies arrive, they're sent out across this country. This truck, being loaded, is destined for the besieged city of Chernihiv, 700 kilometers to the north near the Belarusian border. How they get it in past the Russians is a secret they'd rather not reveal.
Robin, to give you an idea of the size of the problem here, there are 6.5 million people who fled their homes because of the fighting, but are still here in Ukraine. They're trying to get supplies to these people, and then they've also got to try and get supplies into the besieged cities, and that is proving much more difficult. Really, this is a huge logistical nightmare for the Ukrainians.
Michael, thank you for that update. Michael Voss there in Lviv.
Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has addressed French lawmakers about the Russian invasion of his country. He's now spoken to several foreign legislatures, including the US Congress, the British Parliament, and just a few hours ago, the Japanese Parliament. Well, CGTN's Ross Cullen is in Paris for us. Ross, what did Zelensky say to the French Parliament?
Hi, Juliet. Well, what we saw in his speech to French senators and French MPs earlier this afternoon was a tailored message. When he's been addressing specific legislatures, he's been making specific reference to something that it can identify with that country. For example, when he spoke to Israeli MPs, he mentioned that he thought Russia was plotting a final solution in Ukraine. When he spoke to Canadian MPs, he said, can you imagine if Toronto, Vancouver or Edmonton were bombed? And speaking to Japanese lawmakers, he said that Russia could use sarin gas. That was the gas used in a terror attack on the subway system in Japan in the 1990s. So he has been tailoring his message, and he did the same today, saying to French lawmakers that Ukrainians are fighting for liberté, égalité and fraternité, so freedom, equality and togetherness or brotherhood. That's the French national motto, so trying to resonate that with the French parliamentarians. He also said that France is doing what it can, but he wants to see France do more, and that is something that he mentioned specifically when it comes to business. He did say that there are French firms that have left their operations in Russia, but there are other companies that are continuing to do operations in Russia, and we can hear now a little bit more of what the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky had to say to French parliamentarians.
French companies should leave the Russian market. Renault, Auchan, Leroy Merlin and others. They should stop being the sponsors of Russia's war machine. They should stop financing the killing of children and women, rapes. Everyone should be reminded that values matter more than profits.
What we heard there, allegations of sexual violence, sadly, that is something that we see in war zones across the world. Sexual violence used as a weapon of war. Allegations there from Volodymyr Zelensky that is occurring inside Ukraine at the moment during this war. And he also mentioned those three firms, car maker Renault, supermarket Auchan and the hardware and homeware store Leroy Merlin. There are other companies from other countries such as Bosch, a German tech company, Subway, well-known American fast food outlet that are continuing to carry out their operations in Russia. So he did call on those companies from across the world to join with other firms that we have seen leave their operations in Russia to try to help stop the financing of the Russian government, which they are channeling then, Volodymyr Zelensky says, towards their war effort in Ukraine.
Ross, Macron spoke again with Putin and Zelensky on Tuesday, and they'll have lots of FaceTime with European and NATO leaders in the coming days. Let's talk about a diplomatic solution. Is that still the goal for France?
In fact, Volodymyr Zelensky, Juliet, mentioned Emmanuel Macron in his speech to the French Parliament this afternoon. He said that he did welcome Emmanuel Macron's moves to try to pursue a peaceful resolution to the conflict. Emmanuel Macron has had many phone calls with his Western allies like Joe Biden and Boris Johnson, but also regularly speaking to Volodymyr Zelensky, and particular focus on his phone calls with Vladimir Putin, the Russian president. Regular diplomatic lines of communication being opened by the Elysee Palace to try to show Vladimir Putin that there is a diplomatic route out of the conflict. They are willing to talk. They are willing to listen to Vladimir Putin. They are willing to pick up the phone because there are three pillars, Emmanuel Macron says, to this war effort in trying to bring it to an end and trying to find a ceasefire. Number one is through sanctions imposed on Russia, trying to isolate Russia on the international stage and force the Moscow government to bring an end to the war. That's number one. Number two is supporting Ukraine, Ukrainian people, Ukrainian parliament. And number three is the diplomatic path, and that is something that Emmanuel Macron has pursued over the previous weeks. Several phone calls with Vladimir Putin in recent days, also calling Volodymyr Zelensky. And that's something that the Ukrainian president did say. He did recognise from Emmanuel Macron the efforts by Paris to try to bring this war to a peaceful conclusion.
Ross Cullen in Paris, thank you.
Since the start of the war in Ukraine, its neighbours have seen a steady flow of refugees into their countries. In Hungary, almost 1 million people have arrived from different parts of Ukraine. Our correspondent Mia Alberti has been finding out about their journeys.
It's been a month since the start of the conflict in Ukraine, and we're still seeing a large number of refugees coming into Hungary. That hasn't changed. What has changed is where these people are coming from. In the past few days, I talked with many refugees, and most of them are now coming from heavily bombarded cities such as Kharkiv or Chernihiv. And these people have stories to tell about the violence they have witnessed. Some are arriving with injuries, some have lost their houses or their loved ones. And this is something that we didn't see in the first wave of refugees. Those were mostly people that were living as a precaution before the conflict arrived to their doorstep. But this is a different scenario now. At the beginning of the refugee crisis, people were fleeing by car. That's where we saw the long queues at border points. But just yesterday, we went to one of these border crossings, and it was completely empty, meaning that most people are now coming by train or by buses. Some of these buses were the ones that were part of the humanitarian corridors, evacuating people from the most affected cities in Ukraine. They are now arriving with those refugees. But meanwhile, the people that I have met here, volunteers, local officials, have told me that it has been a bit more quiet in the last few days. But that might be, they say, because of the besieging of many Ukrainian cities like Mariupol. So perhaps not as many people are arriving here, but that's because they simply cannot leave.
Mia Alberti reporting from the Hungary-Ukraine border.
Still ahead on Global Business Europe. Panic buying in Germany as the war in Ukraine sparked fears of a food shortage.
The British public not only need to know, but they want to know more about China.
70 years ago, a small group of British businessmen travelled to China to unlock opportunities between the two countries. They became known as the icebreakers.
East meets West. We're now at a time when we need the icebreaker spirit.
My first impression when I came to China is I noticed the similarities more than the differences.
It's about understanding each other's culture.
We look at the things that bring our nation together.
My dad is Chinese, my mom is English.
I grew up in London, but I went to China to work at age 25.
Whenever I've gone to China, it's just been amazingly welcoming.
The music is beautiful language and bringing all the people together.
I'm exploring, I'm experimenting, I'm trying something new, all in the hopes to build a bridge. And I think we definitely need more people doing that.
It was only when I got to know my Chinese father in my 40s that I really got to know the other half of myself.
I hope we make it another 50 years, another 500 years.
Meet the bridge builders, the individuals who dared to think beyond the horizon and open up our world, on TV and online on CGTN.
I hope that you will all become icebreakers and bridge builders.
Welcome back. Remember, CGTN is available to watch for free on all the major digital platforms, on Smart TV or online on Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app. And in the UK, we're available 24 hours a day on Freeview.
Russian President Vladimir Putin says existing energy contracts with what he calls unfriendly countries must now be paid in rubles. If that happens, it could deepen Europe's most serious energy crisis since the 1970s. Our correspondent Julia Chapman is in Moscow, where there are restrictions on what can be reported. Julia, Vladimir Putin has demanded energy contracts with what he calls unfriendly countries be paid in rubles. Is this a serious demand?
It certainly appears to be. This was made today when President Vladimir Putin was meeting with government ministers to talk about the economic situation in Russia, given all of the sanctions that have been introduced against the country over the past month. And this was a decision that he announced at this meeting. It appears to have already been instructed to the Gazprom energy company, one of Russia's largest state-run firms. This is what President Putin had to say.
I made a decision to take action to switch payments for natural gas sold to so-called unfriendly countries into the Russian ruble in the shortest time possible.
The implications of this will be quite interesting. So the list of unfriendly countries, as Russia sees them, is effectively the same list of countries that have introduced sanctions. Many of them are energy buyers from Russia, particularly the European ones. But most of those contracts are usually done in euros or US dollars. Now, if they are insisting on selling energy in Russian rubles here, that will mean that the European countries buying that energy will have to find a way to acquire rubles. Most of them do not have those kind of currency reserves. That would insist that they have to do business with the Russian central bank, which is itself under sanctions. So some analysts are speculating this is an effort to try to get those sanctions lifted off the central bank. They are incredibly significant in the range of sanctions because they effectively cut off Russia from half of its foreign currency reserves. It could, however, have the opposite impact, meaning that Russia would have fewer energy contracts, that some of the sales may not continue. But of course, Europe is still very much dependent on Russia for energy, particularly gas.
And Julia, away from energy, why has Sergei Lavrov given such a strong reaction to the Polish idea of peacekeepers in Ukraine? And how will Russia likely respond to the expulsion of its diplomats in Poland?
Well, Sergei Lavrov and Dmitry Peskov, the spokesperson for the Kremlin, have both been weighing in on this idea that is expected to be put forward in more detail by Poland at the NATO ministers' meeting tomorrow. Certainly, it's an unexpected announcement from Poland. It hasn't exactly been met with accord from all NATO parties, including the US, which has already suggested that this may not be feasible. But it certainly wasn't welcomed here in Russia, where the Kremlin spokesperson spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said it would be a reckless move to put peacekeepers in and that the repercussions would be very hard to undo. Sergei Lavrov, speaking at a meeting that he held today at a university visit here in Moscow, said that this would be the direct clash between NATO and Russian forces that everyone fears. Of course, it comes after Dmitry Peskov yesterday refused to rule out Russia's use of nuclear weapons if he said there was any kind of existential threat against the country.
Julia Chapman in Moscow, many thanks.
As Western sanctions continue to bite in Russia, interest rates have risen to 20% and inflation has hit a 24-year high.
CGTN's Stephen Cole spoke to Sergei Alexashenko, former Deputy Finance Minister of the Russian Federation, and asked him how problematic those economic figures were for ordinary Russians.
Correct, and that is definitely the most evident impact of the... Okay, let's say honest, it's the price of the war. It's not impact of the sanctions, it's the price that Russian people have to pay for supporting Vladimir Putin and his regime. I would say that definitely this is 20-25 at least % of inflation this year will lead to significant decline in living standards, in real incomes, and it may be, I don't know, even 15% for this year. That's really a huge price for the war.
But however the Ukraine conflict plays out, the Russian economy looks as though it's in pretty poor shape and may be in pretty poor shape for some time to come, doesn't it? How do you think Moscow can turn that around, if they could?
Stephen, you're absolutely right. The biggest, then the principal element of the answer on the Russian economy or the state of the economy and will the war will be stopped or not, is that the bulk of economic sanctions, mostly in structural areas, in export bans and so on, they will intensify their pressure in the time being. For example, if there is a ban on export to Russia of some components for the Russian car industry, okay, the car production will stop 2-3 months from now. So the effect on the real sector of the economy of all sanctions will be visible maybe 3-6 months later. And only by then, by the end of this year, we will be able to say how big will be decline in GDP, how big will be decline in living standards.
The UK Finance Minister has cut income tax and fuel duties in a bid to cushion the rapidly rising cost of living. Rishi Sunak says a 1% income tax cut will take effect within 2 years, and he's raised the rate at which employees pay social insurance. Well, Guy Henderson joins us now from London. Guy, good to see you. Some analysts saying he's pulled a rabbit out of the hat. What did Rishi Sunak announce?
Yeah, I mean, on the eve of this spring statement, official figures actually show that the Treasury had £30 billion more than it had forecast it would have at this point in the year. So that had led to some calls for quite a lot of extra support for families facing soaring inflation. So there were calls for a cut to fuel duty, a call to cut VAT perhaps, calls to call off a planned rise in national insurance that's due to kick in next month. That had been planned to try and provide extra funding for the NHS to sort of clear a backlog in the wake of the pandemic. There was even a call from the main opposition Labour Party to tax profits on oil companies who've benefited to some extent from rising oil prices, which have been a driver of rising inflation. So those were some of the calls for the kind of help that the Chancellor, speaking in the Houses of Parliament you'll see behind me here in central London, that MPs have been calling for. This was his actual statement for some of the things that he has actually introduced for supporting people.
This July, people will be able to earn £12,570 a year without paying a single penny of income tax or national insurance. That is a £6 billion personal tax cut for 30 million people across the United Kingdom. Today, I can announce, for only the second time in 20 years, fuel duty will be cut. Yeah. Not by 1, not even by 2, but by 5 pence per litre. The biggest cut to all fuel duty rates ever. And while some have called for the cut to last until August, I have decided it will be in place until March next year, a full 12 months.
So the other thing the Chancellor had announced was that there will be 0% VAT on products designed to increase energy efficiency in your home. So things like solar panels, things like heat pumps. After all of this, one member of Parliament could be heard heckling, is that it? Well, the answer is yes, that is it. And the reason that Chancellery gave for that is that the war in Ukraine is going to cost UK households, and at a time that interest rates are going up, all of that money that the government borrowed during the pandemic is going to have to be paid back, and it's going to be more expensive for the government to pay that back, to the tune, said the Chancellor, of £83 billion next year alone.
Gosh, that's such a huge number, hard to get your head around. Apart from that, is that it from the backbenchers? What's the reaction been so far?
Look, I mean, the Chancellor was keener to point out that before all of this crisis kicked off in Ukraine, that the UK was amongst those countries in the G7 whose economic recovery was moving at the fastest pace. What he perhaps won't be so keen to highlight now that this crisis is underway is that the UK is also amongst the countries facing the highest inflationary pressure in that same G7 group. The Chancellor kept pointing to global patterns that are leading to that and that are responsible for that. You know, the legacy of the pandemic and all the supply disruptions that's caused. Obviously, the war in Ukraine, the Western sanctions that are having a significant inflationary impact as well. But there are things that are UK-specific as well. One of them, perhaps, that the Bank of England has taken, perhaps a slightly more cautionary approach to raising interest rates than some other central banks. One thing that obviously critics will want to highlight as well, and have been highlighting, is that there are also supply disruptions, labour shortages, all of which are contributing to inflation at the moment, that also came as a result of Britain's decision to leave the European Union, BREXIT. All of this means that average UK inflation for the UK over the course of the year is expected to be about 7.4%. At the moment, it's still lower than that. So that means that inflation is likely to continue to rise and that this isn't something that's just going to be a short shock. It's something that could go on for several months.
But the good news is it's going to cost a little bit less to fill up your car at the petrol station. Guy Henderson, thank you.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. No distress call and no pilot response. We'll speak to an aviation expert about what could have happened in the final moments before a China Eastern plane hit the ground.
It is now important that all of us in Europe act very swiftly.
Fines for the non-vaccinated will most likely be between $1,000 and $4,000.
The new Omicron variant circulating in southern Africa.
The financial markets have also reacted badly to the news.
Growing dissatisfaction with the way the Dutch government is handling the pandemic.
Cancelling the city's main public Christmas markets for the second year in a row.
Protests and riots by those opposed to restrictions and vaccinations.
There is no room for complacency in this ongoing battle against COVID.
On the agenda with me, Stephen Cole, we look up into space. We look down into data. We look at debt. We look at politics. We look at opioids, climate change. We look at all the issues that really matter around the world. But you matter too. We want to tell the stories you want to see and hear about. Make it your agenda.
The agreement is signed. But what is the real deal now the UK has left the EU? For trade, for business, for the city, for ordinary people. Make sense of Brexit with CGTN.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and the bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Juliet Mann and me, Robin Dwyer. The headlines again. Ukraine's president says 100,000 people are experiencing inhumane conditions in Mariupol and accuses Russia of capturing an aid convoy.
President Putin says Russia will start charging in rubles for gas supplies to what he calls unfriendly countries.
And the UK government promises a tax cut to help with rising living costs, but it won't take effect until 2024.
German supermarket chains are calling on consumers to stop buying in bulk, with the war in Ukraine spooking shoppers into stockpiling certain items.
The industry says Europe has enough food reserves to withstand major supply disruptions stemming from the conflict, but it's also working on shoring up supplies from elsewhere as part of contingency planning.
From Berlin, Trent Murray reports.
It's an increasingly common sight across German supermarket shelves. Worries over the war in Ukraine have led to a surge in panic buying in some areas, an issue that's now forcing retailers to implement purchasing limits on staples like sugar, flour and cooking oils. But retail groups are also pleading with the public to stop, saying stockpiling isn't necessary because Germany's food supplies are stable and supply chains remain robust.
In the last few weeks, we have seen a rise in panic buying. We know about this phenomenon already from COVID-19. We consider this practice completely unfounded because the security of our food supplies is guaranteed. We currently see no cause for concern.
But the longer-term impacts may still be to come. Ukraine is a major exporter of several bulk commodities, including wheat, grain and seeds. And the conflict is expected to cause considerable disruption to upcoming harvests. That's causing retailers to make contingency plans and source new markets to ensure shelves remain stocked.
We have to look for alternatives, especially alternatives on our doorstep. We can see that we are trying to ramp up regional production again, to utilize farming land better and prioritizing food production over fuel.
The rising cost of energy is also contributing to growing concerns about the broader cost of living. Despite increased international pressure, the German government is resisting calls for a complete boycott of Russian oil and gas. Political experts say that that's in large part because the cost of doing so would be politically very challenging for German politicians.
But I'm not so sure if German society is willing to actually risk undermining its current lifestyle. I think many commentators and more commentators are currently starting to say things like the Germans had it too good for too long. They have been too complacent, too inward looking. I fear that Germany will continue with its hesitant stance, and it won't be a vote winner for any government to say, we're doing things that might affect your lifestyle, the quality of your living conditions, because people in Germany tend to be very economically focused.
But while those conversations are happening here and right across Europe, there's also mounting concern about how the war will affect countries in the developing world that rely on Ukraine for their food supplies. NGOs say that the conflict could cause famine in many parts of the globe, where, unlike Europe, large silos of food reserves simply do not exist. The UN's World Food Programme has warned the ramifications of the crisis in Ukraine will likely ripple well beyond the region, noting that Russia and Ukraine alone account for 30% of global wheat trade. And with many of those shipments held up because of the situation in Ukraine, many countries are now desperately trying to find other sources to backfill lost supplies, which in turn pushes up prices. It's a dangerous cycle the UN is warning could lead to a humanitarian disaster well beyond Ukraine's borders, as some of the world's poorest nations struggle with what are expected to be severe food shortages. Trent Murray, CGTN, Berlin.
Investigators have recovered one of the 2 black boxes from a crashed China Eastern aircraft. It's thought the device could be the cockpit voice recorder. The Boeing 737 was carrying 132 people on board when the accident happened in southern China on Monday. No survivors have been found.
The search and recovery operation at the plane's crash site has intensified, but heavy rainfall is slowing efforts to find out what caused China's worst air disaster in over a decade. He Weiwei reports from Guangxi.
Rainfall has caused a temperature drop and making the rescue operation even more difficult. The search has slowed down. Rescue team found some belongings of people who were on board, like wallets, ID cards, gloves, notebooks, etc. They also marked the wreckage and broken pieces of the crashed plane that they have found.
Our task is to enter the main search area because we're quite experienced in mountain search and rescue. We have brought life detectors, sonar equipment, drones, outdoor rock climbing equipment, rope, chainsaws, etc.
We are now trying to reach the rescue site as close as we can. And as you can see, the soil gets muddy after the rain, so sometimes my boots got stuck. It's really difficult to walk. And you know, over there at the main site of the rescue, the slope over there is even steeper. And there is a bigger risk of a landslide, especially after the rainfall. So you can imagine how difficult the search and rescue operation can be over there. At least 30 sniffer dogs are used in the search operation. Although the central search area is half the size of a football court, but the actual search area is over 20,000 square meters. The wreckage and broken pieces are scattered all around the mountain. Search still mainly relies on manpower rather than machines. He Weiwei, CGTN, Tengshan County, Guangxi Autonomous Region.
Our reporter Cao Chufeng is in the city of Wuzhou, where officials have been giving updates on the issue.
There were 2 press conferences today, and as you've mentioned, the most important information we've received at these 2 press conferences is that one of the 2 black boxes has been found. The investigators are not 100% sure which one they found, given the fact the outer of it is pretty much damaged. But preliminary prediction is that it's very likely it is the voice recorder, and it's already been sent to Beijing, where it will be decoded for data. And after they've received the decoded data, they hope it will shed light into the current investigation. At the same time, rescue and recovery mission continues this afternoon. The team members have found some human tissue fragments near the crashing site, as well as some parts of the plane. Hundreds of relatives of the passengers have moved into Wuzhou City, living at designated hotels. Officials have assigned personnel to attend to their needs, including daily necessities, as well as counseling services. And also this afternoon, some relatives have paid a visit to an area near the crashing site, accompanied by some members of the working group.
That was Cao Chufeng in Wuzhou. Well, let's talk now to David Learmount, who's an aviation expert and consulting editor at Flight Global. He joins us now. Thank you for being on the programme, David. So as we were hearing from our reporter there, one of the black boxes from the plane has now been recovered. What will happen to it? What information can teams hopefully extract from it?
Well, it depends which one it is. There's a cockpit voice recorder which records what the pilots are saying to each other, what air traffic control, what conversation air traffic control has with them, and all the ambient sounds in the flight deck. So you can learn a lot from that. But the recorder that tells us most is the flight data recorder, and that has things like speed, power settings, altitude, everything that the airplane is doing, and it gives a general health check on the aircraft and the profile through the air that the aircraft is following. So when we get that, we learn a lot.
If it is the voice recorder, though, it will back up those suggestions that there was no distress call and no response to air traffic controllers. Why do you think that was?
That's puzzling, but it's not the first time aircraft have ever crashed with no call to anybody. There are various things that can make this happen. Either the aircraft suddenly basically goes out of control, and the pilots are so busy trying to get it back under control that they literally don't have the mental capacity to put out a mayday call. There's that possibility. And there is the other horrifying possibility, for which there is no direct evidence yet, but there have been several cases in the last 30 years, and in fact, even much more recently than that, in about the last 7 years, when pilots have literally taken pilots with a mental problem have taken an opportunity to commit suicide and have not cared that they had a whole airplane full of people with them. And so that the actual dive is deliberate. Now, as I say, there's no direct evidence of that at the moment, but the profile that this flight followed and the descent that this flight followed was remarkably similar to an event such as the one I just discovered, carried out by an airline, or the crew of an airline called Germanwings, which naturally enough was a German airline, in 2015, and everybody on board that was killed. Now, I hope that is not the reason, because it's so ghastly, but the profile looked very, very familiar.
David, I want to ask you about this video that's been widely shared, that it said shows the plane plummeting to the ground. How does that fit into the information we have already?
I'm not at all convinced that what was shown there on I think it was a car dash cam. So we're not talking about high quality photography here. It's quite impossible to work out what that object was that appeared to be falling out of the sky. So I'm not prepared at this stage to believe that has anything to do with this accident.
And you mentioned the flight profile. There's a suggestion, isn't there, that the plane didn't come down at a constant speed or height. What could cause that?
Well, we do know that it was at about 30,000 feet. That's about 9,000 meters. And you know, it took about 3 minutes from the time that it was flying level until the time it hit the ground. Now, that descent rate, if it was constant throughout, would be a very fast descent rate of about 10,000 feet per minute. But it seems from the tracking signal that we have from Flight Radar 24, which tracks aircraft and the commercial tracking service, it indicates that the descent was not constant, and that at some points the descent was really frantic, and other points it actually was arrested, and there was even a slight climb. Now, again, with that link that they get, that's supplied by this particular technology, I'm not sure how absolutely we can trust every single small detail of it. But one thing is absolutely certain: that aircraft descended from its cruising altitude to impact at the average rate at which a pilot would put an aircraft into an emergency descent on purpose if, for example, there was a sudden decompression and all the air escaped from the airplane at high altitude where the air is thin. And the pilots wanted to get the aircraft down into thicker air so everybody could breathe without having to have a supplementary oxygen. That is about the rate, the average rate, that they would carry out such a descent. But if that had been the case, they would have leveled out at about 10,000 feet, about It didn't do that. So we're back to the sort of what on earth happened here? Are we talking about sabotage, something terribly sudden, or are we talking about a deliberate act?
David Learmount, good to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed for joining us.
Still ahead on CGTN, exploring the planet, the immersive exhibit of the Earth and our environment.
So this is it. I'm just about to be shot.
Tense here. Bottles are being thrown as they do so.
There are about 3 critical bridges here in Malawi. That's one of them. We're going to cross that bridge.
As you can see behind me, police forces
who are replying with gas. Gas just came in.
Tear gas. So it's all begun now.
Divisions leading the charge into West Mosul have brought us here.
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots.
This is where most of the fighting has been concentrated.
It's the front line now after 9 days of fighting.
We're about 2 to 3 kilometers from
the front line. Within clear view of this front line position.
Have you ever wondered how much a human life is worth?
Have you ever looked up at the night sky and considered whether aliens are staring back? Or if it's even possible to measure intelligence?
If that sounds like you, it's time to join the Answers Project with me, Stephen Cole.
And me, Mari Beveridge.
We've recruited the best brains in the world, award-winning astrophysicists, giants of medical science, and former presidential advisors to help us tackle humanity's biggest questions.
Find the answers wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back. US President Joe Biden is travelling to Brussels for an emergency summit on Ukraine. European and NATO leaders are expected to roll out additional sanctions against Russia.
Ahead of Thursday's meeting, NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg said member states will boost defences in Eastern Europe to help prevent the war spreading beyond Ukraine's borders.
The first step is the deployment of 4 new NATO battle groups in Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania and Slovakia. Along with our existing forces in the Baltic countries and Poland, this means that we will have 8 multinational NATO battle groups all along the eastern flank, from the Baltic to the Black Sea.
Well, Thursday's summit will be the 3rd gathering of EU leaders since the Ukraine conflict started a month ago.
EU countries have reacted quickly and been broadly unified in their response to the crisis, with Poland and Hungary playing prominent roles despite clashing heavily with Brussels before Russia's invasion. Linda Kennedy reports.
This is the table Ukraine's President Zelensky wants to join. The European Council, where the 27 EU leaders take a seat. It hasn't changed in number, but observers note a change of pace and pecking order. On the 24th of February, as the conflict began, an emergency meeting was held.
Tonight, European leaders were fully aligned in condemning the atrocious and unprovoked attacks. Now we have to meet the moment.
They rapidly announced sanctions on Russian banks, state-owned companies and aviation. And that was just the start. Arriving that night was the Prime Minister of Poland, whose government was found to have broken EU law over refugees in the past, and against which the EU had taken legal action on Poland's judicial independence. It might have felt like hostile company. He didn't sound cowed.
Enough of this cheap talking. There is enough of naivety around us, triviality. I believe we have to really act, and we have to react in a very decisive way.
And his country did, welcoming people fleeing the conflict. Thousands every day, now reaching past 2 million. In early March, the European Council President even wanted to tell the world about support for Poland, live-streaming his thoughts on making the trip.
See what's the concrete situation on the ground. This also in order to give a very strong message of support to the Polish people, to the Polish authorities, because what the Polish people and authorities are doing now is extremely important for all of us.
The next assembly of EU leaders was at Versailles, outside Paris, on the 10th of March. Among the arrivals, Hungary's Viktor Orban. greeted warmly by the French president, despite being accused of breaking EU regulations over rule of law. 300,000 refugees have now been taken in by Hungary, and the country's turned away from old ally Russia in favour of the EU. President Macron looked happy to pose for a handshake. Criticism of Hungary's LGBTQ clampdown set aside for now. Prime Minister Orban has raised EU eyebrows with his policies. At Versailles, though, joking with the media, he appeared one of the gang. Little wonder no one was clear about others' positions in the Versailles family photo. It might have seemed there was a new order. There are now different divisions. Energy is the big one. Germany is resisting sanctions on Russian oil and gas. Leaders of Baltic countries and Poland are urging an end to European purchase of Russian energy. And the Versailles Declaration, after the meeting, ruled out immediate EU membership for Ukraine, though Eastern member states are keener than Western ones to find ways to speed up the application.
It's even likely that the EU will hold off on using a new tool to withhold budget payments from countries which are accused of breaking the rules, like Poland and Hungary. But EU leaders talk a lot about democratic fundamentals and tolerance in order to show unity in their condemnation of Russia. It could be said they're setting aside some of those values for now. Linda Kennedy, CGTN, Brussels.
Well, Marky Jan Lubkivsky is an advisor to Ukraine's defence minister, and he told me about the situation in the capital, Kyiv, during the past 24 hours.
So one more extremely hard night and day for Ukrainians. So an air raid has been announced 5 times this morning in my Kyiv, in my city. So very loud explosions were heard and still heard in the middle of Kyiv. So situation is rather critical because the geography of attacks is very wide from Severodonetsk in the eastern part of Ukraine. Kyiv was shelled Obolon. This is the northern part of Kyiv, Midtown, Pavlograd in Dnipropetrovsk region. So geography is very wide. We are losing a lot of civilians every day. And situation in Mariupol, as it was mentioned by your colleagues, is very close to the tragedy. It's a real tragedy. The enemy turned Mariupol into new Aleppo.
As a senior official in the Ukrainian Defence Ministry, what can you tell us about how Ukraine can tackle and ultimately repel Russian forces?
Our army is very good in protecting Ukraine and Ukrainians. So we are fighting on every square meter of our territory. We managed to stop the aggressor on the northern part of Kyiv, and we are fighting for every city. The spirit of Ukrainians is very high, together as well as the moral of Ukrainian soldiers.
What about talks with Russia? They keep stalling. What needs to happen?
So talks are ongoing, unfortunately without any big success, but we still account on a pressure made by international community on Russian Federation's sanctions should be threatened and made more wide and more strong. And again, the losses of Russians are very big in Ukraine. They lost already 15,000 their soldiers. So I think that these two facts are the base to change the approach of Russian Federation.
US President Biden will be in Europe later today. If you were in the room and you could have a word in his ear, what would you say?
We're really looking forward to get more support from our Euro-Atlantic partners. Be brave. So on the eve of the NATO and EU summit in Europe, we're really looking forward to get more support from our partners in terms of aircrafts, anti-air system. It is very important because we are quite good on the ground, but we are still not protected from the air.
Now, fancy taking the first immersive augmented reality journey through our planet? Well, that's what's being offered at a new exhibit in New York.
Arcadia Earth is designed to highlight the impact of climate change and show steps that every one of us can take to tackle it. Karina Huber reports.
When you enter Arcadia Earth, you are met with a series of questions.
Did you know how many bottles of water it takes to produce 1 pound of meat? Is it A, 2,000, B, 10,000, C, 14,000?
The goal is to get you to think about how our behavior affects our planet and what we can do to change it. The exhibit consists of 15 rooms, each dedicated to a different area related to sustainability and climate change.
Ooh, this is pretty.
Much of the focus is on our oceans, where plastic pollution is wreaking havoc on marine life, and rising temperatures are causing dramatic changes to our ecosystem. But the exhibit doesn't just highlight problems. It also lists simple actions we can take to minimize our impact. They include reducing the use of single-use plastics, eating less meat, and buying reef-safe sunscreen.
There's a list of 40 actions that you can take. I'll be very happy if we pick one, right?
Arcadia Earth is the brainchild of Valentino Vittori. He previously built immersive experiences for the fashion industry. But after listening to a talk by environmentalist Paul Hawken at a Summit Series conference in 2017, Vittori gave everything up to start Arcadia Earth.
If I'm a good father today, I want my kids to simply have a planet to live. So I went back. I decided to change career. I stopped working, I mortgaged my house, I went to have all the possible credit cards loan that I have, and I self-finance everything.
The gamble paid off. The exhibit has been so successful, Vittori's launched another one in Las Vegas. Part of the appeal is how interactive it is.
I'm on the savannah in Africa right now. And, whoa! There's a lioness in front of me.
There's virtual reality and augmented reality throughout the exhibit.
So I downloaded the Arcadia Earth app here, which gives me access to a lot of the augmented reality features to this exhibit. Let's give it a shot with this. Discover your carbon footprint. Not the foot. Here we go.
The app asks you to answer a series of questions related to your daily behavior to determine your carbon footprint.
Ah, you score 7 tons below the average. All right.
But perhaps the real draw is how beautiful Arcadia Earth is. Each room is curated by an environmental artist, making it an ideal setting for a photo shoot. Vittori is acutely aware of how important visuals are in today's social media-obsessed culture.
You get to come and experience an exhibit who give you amazing content. Like, who doesn't want to take a picture in this room, correct? But then when you share, all we really ask is that instead of talking about nonsense, that you maybe hashtag an irrelevant cause, or maybe you make a vow, and maybe you say, like, I came, I learned, and from now on I decide not to, right? And you make a change. That would be amazing.
Karina Huber, CGTN, New York.
The headlines again. Ukraine's president says 100,000 people are experiencing inhumane conditions in Mariupol and accuses Russia of capturing an aid convoy.
President Putin says Russia will start charging in rubles for gas supplies to what he calls unfriendly countries.
Search teams find a black box from the crashed airliner in southern China, thought to be the cockpit's voice recorder.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thanks for watching.
More on all our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
We're on smart TV apps, Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube and Dailymotion, cgtn.com and the CGTN app. And in the UK, 24 hours a day on Freeview.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all of the team here in London, goodbye.
Goodbye.